Good afternoon, Strategy. We are very fortunate today to have with us Joe Bryan. I'm going to let Joe introduce himself, but Joe has become quite famous in the Bitcoin world lately with a video that he made for his friends about the big red button and why it's a problem. Just to raise the hands in the room, how many people watched Joe's video before this? All right, half the room. Well, we'll go with that. Joe's going to talk for about a half an hour about one segment of his video in particular after introducing himself, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end if people have questions. With that, I will go ahead and introduce Joe. I'm going to turn my video off and take it away, Joe.
Okay, all right. I'm going to share the screen then. Hopefully, Ed, if you just confirm that you can see that, okay?
Confirmed.
Okay. All right, great. Well, firstly, thank you ever so much for inviting me to talk with you all today. This is not what I expected to be doing a month ago when I released this video, and thank you for taking the time to sit and listen. And as Ed said, I'll run you through it. It'll probably be about 25 minutes, and then there'll be some time at the end for any questions that you may have about this or just anything else in general as far as Bitcoin is concerned. So let's go. Okay. Well, it sounds by now that some of you already know who I am, which is still quite surreal. But my name's Joe Bryan, and you can see me on X at SatmoJoe. My background, I did physics at Oxford before joining Goldman Sachs, and then I spent 10 years as an equity derivatives trader, mainly at Goldman, but also a couple of other banks as well, before moving into away from the city and into sports, where I set up a quant engineering business with a colleague, where we would model sports, write algorithms, and create real-time trading systems. We're ultimately acquired by a bookmaker after a few years, and we spent the last 5 years up until 2024 scaling that business from a national champion to a global player. Now, the reason I'm no longer doing that is because in 2020 I found Bitcoin, and I come across Bitcoin a couple of times before, but I think like many people had dismissed it as a Ponzi scheme or not worthy of attention or flawed in some way. And it's because I didn't put the work in, or even a small amount of work really, to get over that first hurdle. And my God, I wish I'd done it sooner. But I did it in 2020, and now there is nothing more important for me to be working on than spending all my time, all my working time, trying to help people understand Bitcoin and helping Bitcoin win as quickly as possible. And that's the context of which I'm here today. Now, I'm very grateful for half of you having already watched this, and hopefully after this, the other half might be motivated to also watch it. But the boss posted this about a month ago now, a few days after I launched the video to very few people on my X account, and then a few days later found that Michael Saylor had posted it to 4 million people, which has sort of turned my world upside down a little bit for the last month, and given me opportunities like this to talk to people. Now the video itself is I'll talk about the video itself in a second, but my aim here today is simply to encourage you to each take your next steps with Bitcoin. And everyone's at different stages here and has different interests and personality types and other things. And Bitcoin is like a multi-headed hydra. There is something for everybody to get started, no matter where you are in your current position. And so that's my aim today. Now, what I hope to cover is a brief dip into the past, linking that to one of the core sections of the video, which I think then helps link the real issue back to our daily lives, and then combining the two and linking that to what you guys are doing today at Strategy, and really helping share with you how I think about your company. And you may agree or disagree, but maybe it'll give you a slightly different frame of reference and a broader mental model for thinking about the world. And so this guy, I imagine very few, if any of you recognize him, because this is a picture from 1923, but this guy is Hugo Steins. And he was at one point the wealthiest person in Germany. His wealth was the same as Musk plus Bezos plus Buffett times 10. And he amassed that wealth over the period of about 3 or 4 years before his untimely death in 1924. Now, we'll get into how he did that and why it's relevant for you guys in a second. But someone you may recognize is this guy. This guy's Fiatello. And for the half the people in the room who haven't seen the video, Fiatello is in charge of one half of an island where both halves have perfect money, but Fiatello has perfect money and a big red button. And this big red button allows him to change any aspect of perfect money whenever he needs to. And he changes it in 2 fundamental ways, but only one of them is really relevant for this conversation today. And that is whenever he presses the big red button, he can print some extra money costlessly for the government. And so I'll take you through probably the most in-depth slide that appears in the video, because it will help everybody, hopefully, with that skeletal mental model to understand why money printing, which is only possible by the government and central bank via pressing the big red button, infects absolutely everything in our lives. And so all the problems that we see around ourselves today share, at least in part, but primarily solely driven in most cases by the big red button and the money printing. So I'll run you through this slide and then I'll bring you back to how that is relevant for Hugo Steins and strategy. So when Fiatello presses the big red button, he's printing money, which is just simply debasing the currency. He's printing for free what other people have to work for. And so overnight, he's creating more Fiatellos, which is the name of his currency, in the system, but not increasing the amount of goods and services available to everybody in the economy overnight. And so this has 3 major impacts. The first one is a distortion of the price signals. The second is that business input costs increase for everybody. And the third is it leads to asset inflation. So that first one, prior to Fiatello pressing the big red button, the only reason prices would change in this free market with perfect money is if there was a change in demand and supply. But the extra money he's created has gone into the pocket of the government. So for that to reach the economy, it requires the government to spend it directly or indirectly with people and companies connected to the government, which ends up changing the prices in those areas of the economy and look like extra demand. When it's not extra demand, it's just money printing. So it distorts the price signals. Now that's a signal to everyone else in the economy that there's a demand-supply imbalance, and the active entrepreneurs and the active capital in the market get pulled in closer to the government, seeing this as an opportunity rather than just a distortion, and pulling their attention away from more productive areas of the economy. And it leads to a misallocation of capital, both real, monetary, and human. The second is that business input costs increase. So every business on Fiatello's side of the island has a human being and or some energy input costs or raw material input costs in their business. And so every company is now faced with a choice. In order to protect the small amount of profit they require to incentivize their continued activities as a business, they've then got to make some changes to how they reestablish that profit margin. So if your input costs go up, you either pass on the price increase to your customers, so you keep the product the same size, same quality, you just increase the price. Or you keep the price the same, quality the same, and you shrink the product. So now the customer gets 90 grams and not 100 grams. Or you find some way to reduce those input costs again and keep the size the same and the price the same for the customer. Now, this is where consumer inflation comes from. It is the only source of consumer inflation. It is the money printer. It is nothing else. Despite what the media says, it is nothing else. Now, if you pass on the price increase to the customer or you shrink the product, both of these things reduce affordability for the population. They either pay more for the same thing or they receive less for the same amount. Now, instead, if a business wants to try and reduce its input costs, it does that most simply just by firing people. And if it does that, again, it reduces the affordability for the population, but it also does something else. It puts additional pressure on the government, because now the government has to figure out how to deal with supporting these newly unemployed people. But if a business wants to reduce input costs without firing people, they do it the more insidious way, which is to reduce their input quality. And so what Fiatello starts to see on his island is that he sees a rise in obesity as fresh, healthy ingredients in the food start being replaced with lower quality ingredients at lower cost, increased levels of industrial sludge. And this creates an obesity crisis. It leads to other health crises as well, which again put more pressure on the government to now step in and deal with. But the third one is asset inflation. Now, since he started pressing the big red button, the stock market's been flying, the house prices are going up, all the assets are going up in price when measured in Fiatello's. Now, Fiatello thinks he's like solved economics here. So I can press the big red button, print this extra money, and then everyone's better off. But what's happening here is the people who own the assets see the value go up in Fiatello's, but the people who don't own the assets are even further behind. They're becoming poorer relative to the total share of the pie at a time when they are suffering from reduced affordability through the cost of living. And you also see an increased level of homelessness because now houses are more expensive, renting is more expensive, fewer people can afford it, and it puts more pressure on the government to solve that as well. But because asset prices are going up, it becomes the prevailing wisdom within society that you've just got to be invested. You wouldn't keep the Fiatellos in your pocket anymore because you're giving up yield. Like, you should be buying the stock market. You should be buying a second home. You should be buying speculative assets because they never go down. You're a fool if you don't. And so you start to see more and more leverage entering the economy, whether it's the individual, it's the company, it's the state, pushed by the banking sector. And when you have higher asset prices and greater leverage and reduced affordability, it means that people, families that used to be able to buy a house with one salary can't anymore. You now require two working parents to be able to afford a home and afford to live. And when you have both parents working, they're spending less time together, less time with their children. You start to see the breakdown of the nuclear family. And beyond that, you start to see a decline in the birth rates because people can't afford to have more children, because it means they have to then give up work, or they go to work and then they've got to pay for childcare, which becomes more expensive. And so Fiatello starts to see a decline in birth rates, which puts more pressure on his demographics. The population starts to age. There are fewer young people coming through to support, and he realizes the promises he made to the older segments in society about when they might be able to retire, or the quality of life that they would have in their retirement and their purchasing power, he can't deliver upon. So he has to find ways to undermine the quality of those things that he has already promised. But for people who are not in a position to buy, or are not old enough to feel like they are ready to buy a house, when assets go up too much, you're left in a position potentially where you feel like you can never buy a house. You're stuck renting. And if you're stuck renting, but the cost of rent goes up too much every few years, you can't plan and feel like you can put down roots. And so if people start bringing a shorter time horizon to their decision making, they start to live more for today and not for tomorrow. They put off getting married, they put off having children, leads to declining birth rates. And a segment of society as well is even worse off, that they struggle to feed themselves and home themselves. It's not about planning for the future. It's about surviving on a day-to-day basis. And they're on a treadmill of decline. And this treadmill of decline leads to hopelessness and a health crisis driven by addiction, and all of this leads to a mental health crisis. And Fiatello realizes that by pressing the big red button, he's just created a huge range of secondary issues that he now has to deal with. And he has to deal with it by the government getting involved, by allocating more capital back into the market to try and deal with these issues, which is a greater misallocation of capital. And then between the misallocation of capital and the more leverage in the economy, it sows the seeds of the next emergency. And Fiatello only has one choice when this happens, and that choice is simply to press the big red button again. There is no way out other than just to print more money to try and paper over the cracks. And so he ends up in a situation where this just goes round and round and round with no hope of resolution. It's just about keeping the show on the road. But the inevitability is just more and more money gets printed. So there's more and more debasement, and each of these factors just gets more and more accentuated. But the one area of this chart which is of particular interest to strategy is asset inflation. And it's what we're going to talk about next. So what did Hugo Stein do? Well, what happens in fiat economies where someone has access to a big red button is inevitably they press it, and they press it, and they press it, and they press it some more. And we've all seen pictures like this from our history books. And this was Germany in the early 20s, 100 years ago. But the same has happened all around the world, because inevitably fiat currencies just print fiatellos. There is no other end game here. And this is exactly what happened in Germany. And this chart on the left is obviously a 6-year period from 1918 through start of 1918 through to the end of 1923, where it shows the number of paper marks after the end of the First World War that were required to buy one gold mark, and it went from around 1 to 1 trillion in 6 years. And so what happened? Well, they had access to a big red button, and so they printed fiatellos. And obviously they printed marks, but I'm going to talk about fiatellos because all fiat currencies they're just fiatellos. And the people realized increasingly that they couldn't save their economic energy. They go out and do a day's work and they get paid in fiatellos, and they see the next day those fiatellos are worth less. They then want to get rid of the fiatellos as quickly as possible into something which is a better store of their economic energy. Now, Hugo Stein recognized this very early on, and so not only did he get rid of his fiatellos, he took the opposite side of that. He went out and borrowed as many fiatellos as he possibly could to buy hard assets. And for him, hard assets was companies, it was infrastructure, it was commodities. He ended up owning around 4,500 big companies in Germany over this 2 or 3 year period. And so what happened? He borrowed these fiatellos, and then the fiatellos declined further in value, effectively eroding his debts in real terms. And because the fiatellos were declining, there was yet more and more budgetary and currency crises, and the government had no choice but to just hit the big red button again. And this went round and round and round, and he just repeated the same cycle over and over again. And it was almost perfect, almost. And so what really was he doing? Well, the government have the big red button, and the question is, are they going to press it? And if they press it or they don't press it, which side are you on? Are you on the losing side? Are you on the winning side? And when you watch the video, you'll understand that most of society here is on the losing side. Even the wealthy are on the losing side here. The politically connected are the only segment of society that benefit from the money printing. But all of society is more on the side of they will never press it. because they're either unaware that the government is pressing the button, or they don't have access to certain things which would enable them to bet on the fact that they will press it forever. And what Hugo was able to do was leverage his position and his access to financial markets to take the other side of the bet. So he leveraged up as much as he could in the thing that was going to zero to buy the thing that was of limited quantity. And so buying these companies, buying commodities, enabled him to use them as effective economic storage, economic energy storage, while everything else got inflated away. Now, that was an amazing bet, but it could have been better. He was missing something. He was missing Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the ultimate here, but it didn't exist. But now here we are, 100 years later.
We don't have audio on the that video, so explain what they're saying.
Ah, you can't hear it. Oh, that's a shame. I'm just gonna skip on. That is effectively Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve. Apologies, I thought you'd be able to hear the video. Explaining to 60 Minutes that the US government, the central bank, can print as much money as it wants, but it doesn't tend to print it physically, although it can, and it distributes it via the Federal Reserve. They just print it digitally, and they can print as much of it as they like. And he's only saying what we all already know. But the complexity with which the money printing occurs via quantitative easing or all of the technical jargon goes to hide the fact that the monetary base is just expanding in exactly the same way as it expanded for Germany in the early 1920s and every other country around the world. And so it's just nice to hear it in his own words, in his own voice. But this chart here is, again, taken from the video, but this shows the red chart on the left-hand axis is the monetary base in the US, which is now north of 22 trillion. And the blue chart is the US national debt, which is now above 36 trillion. This chart is slightly out of date on the right-hand side. Now, I've labeled 1971 because this is when the US unilaterally came off the gold standard. Prior to 1971, you could exchange your dollars for a certain amount of gold. But Nixon took the US off, and then every other country in the world followed. And effectively, it allowed the US to print as many dollars as it likes because it was positioned at the center of the entire financial system. But this 36 trillion doesn't include the 50 to 200 trillion of unfunded liabilities the government has. So this is promises to make payments that it hasn't had to make yet, for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, etc. Now there's a range there because they're paid over a long period of time, so you can choose to discount them into today's money at different rates. But if you think about it, the US government is losing 2 trillion a year, is $36 trillion in debt, and owes another 50 to 200 trillion on top of that. The only way out is just to print more dollars, because you can't go bust because you can print your own currency. And so the money printer is just systematically destroying the US dollar's purchasing power in exactly the same way as the fiatellos were destroyed in 100 years ago in Germany. The outcome is inevitable. But the dollar is the best that we have. Every person in the world would swap their currency in a heartbeat for what you guys get to use. And this is the change of every other currency versus the dollar over a 10-year period. And some currencies have ceased to exist completely. So this isn't a US-centric problem. This is an everywhere problem. But the US dollar is just going to zero more slowly than everything else. And so how does this affect you guys? Well, strategy is just doing the Hugo Stein's trade. Strategy is the next inflation king. The US government is pressing the big red button, or the central bank, People realize they can't save their economic energy in fiatellos. And we all know this, right? Everybody knows this intuitively, that you can't put money in the bank and expect the purchasing power to be the same in a year's time or 5 years' time or 10 years' time. You can't. You can't. It's being stolen. It's being stolen through inflation. And the inflation is higher than the central bank tell us, because we all know it. We'll see it with our own eyes when we go to the shops. We go to the grocery store. We know the inflation is not 2% or 5%. It's like 10% more. We know this. But then Strategy borrows fiatellos to not just buy hard assets, but to buy Bitcoin. And the fiatellos decline further in value, triggering more budgetary and currency crises, and you have to press the big red button again, and the cycle just goes round and round and round. And this is what Strategy is doing. But it's also not like Strategy is not the next inflation king. It's the last inflation king. There is nothing that comes after this, because Bitcoin is the final destination here. Bitcoin is the only absolutely scarce asset in the entire universe. There is nothing harder than Bitcoin. There is nothing to move to from Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is the separation of money and state. So it can't be inflated away. So you guys are the last. But you also have a second advantage. A second advantage that Hugo Steins didn't have. You're actually not the last inflation king. You're the last inflation and monetization king. Of where Bitcoin sits in the list of assets in the world. And it's 7th, so it's just above silver. If you look at what's above it, you've got gold, and then you've got 5 companies. To think that the total value of Bitcoin is less than any company in the world, let alone 5 of them, is ludicrous. Bitcoin is decentralized, immutable, neutral money for the world. It's a civilizational change technology. We're going to go through this once, like the internet. And Bitcoin's going to make the internet, the change to our lives from the internet, pale in significance. Because the internet only affects our online lives and our offline lives by a lack of attention, I guess. But money affects everything. It affects our day-to-day decision making. It affects our goals. It affects our life choices. It affects everything. And to think that Bitcoin is worth less than any company, let alone 5 of them, is ludicrous. And even if your mental model for Bitcoin was, well, it's just digital gold. Even if it was as limited as that, which is not a bad place to start, absolutely. Well, Bitcoin is so much more than that. But even if it was just that, it's 1/10 of gold. It beats gold hands down on every single measure that you could care to evaluate it. And so we are just so early. And really what Bitcoin is competing against is not assets, it's asset classes. And the numbers on this table for Bitcoin and gold slightly don't match the previous table because this is taken from a slightly different time. Thank you to Jesse Myers. But the visual representation here shows how early we are. Bitcoin is 2 trillion and the total global asset base is 900 trillion plus. Bitcoin is going to eat gold. It's going to eat art. It's going to eat cars and collectibles. It's going to eat all of these things. It's going to eat real estate. It's going to eat them because all of these things have been monetized. We know we can't keep our dollars in the bank because they're declining to 0. So what do? We buy a second house. We buy the stock market. We buy some collectibles because they're a better store of value. But we wouldn't have done that if we could have bought Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin smashes everything else. So Bitcoin's going to eat all of these things. It's going to demonetize them all. And so the end game here is that they just continue to press the big red button. And the more they do, the more Bitcoin eats the world. And the more Bitcoin eats the world, the more they need to press the big red button. And it's just inevitable. The outcome is inevitable. We're just so early. And it's inevitable through game theory, because every individual, every company, every country in the world is going to end up owning Bitcoin. It is money for you, it's money for your friends, it's money for your competitors, but it's money for your enemies as well. And if you know everyone's going to buy it, and you know if you don't buy it, you're at a disadvantage, then you have to buy it. And if you have to buy it, you buy it as early as possible, and you buy as much of it as possible. And this is exactly what you guys are doing. And you have one amazing final advantage, is that you're in America. And you are at the home of the free market. You may not feel like that all the time, but compared to everywhere else, you're in the freest market in the world. And you have access to an inordinate amount of capital and a huge amount of innovative capital. And so that, combined with the fact that you've got this inflation trade and the monetization trade, and you're in the best country in the world to execute this, it just means Strategy is the most important company in the world today. And beyond that, it's going to become the most valuable company in the world today. And I hope, and the reason for that is Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin. And I realize the vast majority of people who work for MicroStrategy probably wouldn't class themselves as Bitcoiners today. But I would hope, perhaps when you've seen the video or after this presentation, you might be more motivated to take some time and make those first steps, and don't make the mistakes that I made by rejecting Bitcoin several times before finally putting that little bit of work in, because it changes everything. It changes you, it changes your decision making, it gives you a glimpse into the future. And if you are interested to learn more, then if you'd like to go to satsversusfiat.com, which is where What's the Problem lives, I've got 5 additional videos there covering different aspects of Bitcoin, all starter videos, so it's accessible to everybody. But if you're interested maybe in the financial system, or how Bitcoin works, or how Bitcoin is bringing empowerment through commerce and freedom and energy all around the world, there's a great talk there by Alex Gladstein, and I understand he may be coming to talk to you as well in one of these sessions, so that would be amazing. There's also a video there which explains how, which may not always be obvious to you guys, and certainly for me as well in the UK, but the degree to which the financial system is tilted in our favor at the expense of most other countries in the world. And then there is obviously, there has to be one of Michael Saylor on there, which is There Is No Second Best, which is, I challenge anyone with even a small inclination towards the business world not to watch that and not be fired up completely that Bitcoin is going to take over the world. So I hope there's something there for everybody. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Let's give Joe a round of applause first.